All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to, I guess we're now in week number 4 for MPA 623. Hope everyone's doing well and your week is off to a good start. Tonight, obviously, we're going to be talking about goals and the impact of goals on organizational effectiveness. But before we get to that point in time, let me just do a couple of quick announcements. The first one is for your most recent Canvas essay posting. I have graded all those that have come in by about 5 o'clock today. I didn't provide feedback on those because, like I normally do, because obviously it was the topic from your background paper, so I'd already provided you feedback on the background paper. So for this Canvas essay, I just gave you a grade and didn't provide feedback like I normally do. Your next Canvas essay, obviously, for this coming week looks at missions and goals. And so for this one, what you'll be doing is you'll be posting the mission statement for your organization or organization that you are familiar with. You're going to be identifying in your Canvas essay 2 primary goals of the organization. How does the issue or the problem that you've identified in your background paper, how does that issue or problem inhibit the achievement of these organizational goals? So mission, goals, how does your problem inhibit the achievement of those organizational goals? So that's your Canvas essay for this week. As always, your initial response needs to be posted no later than Friday, and then your response post by Sunday. That's one assignment for this week. Then you also know that your second assignment for this week is the alternative solutions paper, and that is due then next Monday on February 21st. Remember, for the alternative solutions paper, what you're doing is you are providing for me 3 alternative solutions to the problem or the issue that you used in your background paper. For each one of those alternative solutions, I'm asking you to identify the alternative solution for me. Tell me what the solution is, tell me how it will solve the problem or address the issue from your background paper, and what specific steps need to be taken in order to implement this solution. Secondly, for each one of your alternative solutions, tell me about the actors who are involved in that solution. So who would be involved in developing and implementing the solution? What roles would each individual or group play? How would you get their agreement and get their buy-in from each one of these actors? And then the third thing for each of these alternative solutions, talk to me about the implementation of that solution. How easy or difficult do you think implementation would be? So alternative identification, actor involvement, and implementation, those 3 things for each one of your 3 alternative solutions. So that's the assignment for coming up for Monday. You'll need to turn that in by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, February 21st. Any questions on either the Canvas essay or the alternative solutions paper? Let's see, I see in text chat we have a question from Melissa. Do we include the first paper and the second paper? No, you don't have to do that for the alternative solutions paper. You won't have to worry about including the background in the alternative solutions paper until you get to the final paper. So for this one, it's just the alternative solutions.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, seeing no other questions, one more announcement, just really kind of well, a couple more. One is just kind of a reminder, and that is next week next Monday on February 21st, as I told you about before, I'm going to be traveling back from Texas. And so with the way in which flights get delayed and all those types of things, I'm not 100% sure that we'll be able to have class next Monday. So keep an eye on our Canvas site. If I need to cancel class, I will put an announcement up on our Canvas site and send out an email. So watch your emails and watch the Canvas site, and hopefully I'll have an idea of that before too late on Monday. So if we need to cancel that class, but right now we're kind of iffy as to whether or not we'll have class next Monday. I'm planning on it, but we'll see if travel plans intervene there. Then the next announcement, if you will, is just, I guess, another reminder is that, as you know, you get participation points for being in our Zoom sessions on Monday nights. And you also know that for some reason you can't attend. All you have to do is just send me an email and let me know that, and then go and watch the recording later in the week to get those participation points. if you could during this week, if you just go back and check the grade book, and if you see there's a week where you're missing points for the virtual session participation and you were in the session or you watched the recording and reach out to me in advance, if you don't have points there, just send me an email and let me know, and I can go back and put those points in, because there are a couple of instances where there are missing points in the grade book for that participation element. And I just want to make sure everyone gets the points that they earn. So just sometime this week, take a look at the grade book and let me know if you see any discrepancy there in terms of the points awarded. Okay. How I have tonight envisioned is that, I thought in the first part of class here, we'll talk a bit about goals, objectives, and how those goals have an impact upon our effectiveness as individuals as well as an organization. Talk briefly about what the literature says about the utility of goals, some of the obstacles that can inhibit the implementation of goals. Talk about some of that information, just very briefly talk a bit about where goals come from in terms of strategic planning, because I know a lot of us have gone through strategic planning processes in our organizations. Some of us probably have led a strategic planning process, so you're probably pretty well versed in strategic planning. But just to do a quick refresher on strategic planning. And then if we get done with that presentation of that material and discussion of that material, then I thought we'd do our breakout groups. So we're going to probably do our breakout groups earlier tonight than we usually do. So we'll probably get to our breakout groups in maybe about half an hour or so. Do our breakout groups, and then after we reconvene from our breakout groups and share out, then take a break. And then after the break, I thought I would present then to you our models of effectiveness and present to you those 4 different models of effectiveness, just in case we're not able to have class next week. Get those models presented this week so that you'll be able to move onward and upward in terms of doing your next Canvas essays. So that is the plan of attack for tonight. So let's talk a bit about goals and the role that goals play in organizational effectiveness. Now, not all goals are created equally. And there are some goals that we consider to be official goals. These official goals are going to be the goals that we oftentimes see expressed in mission statements, in strategic plans, and annual reports. These are oftentimes our longer term goals. So these official goals are certainly going to guide the behavior of the organization. They're going to help specify the values of the organization. They kind of serve as these de facto value statements for the organization. Really signals employees as well as signals those who come into contact with the organization what the value system, the culture of that organization really is. If done correctly and if communicated correctly, these official goals can also enhance organizational legitimacy. They can make the organization certainly seem legitimate, not only in the eyes of employees, but also in the eyes of those who come into contact with that organization. And probably most notably, official goals, if done correctly, can really help to guide employee behavior and can also help motivate employee behavior. So if you have well-established goals that are clear and hopefully achievable, you can communicate those goals to your employees, and then your employees have a direction in which they are working. They know what they are trying to accomplish, what the organization is trying to accomplish, and oftentimes that not only guides their behavior, but it also can motivate them as well. Now, there are longer-term goals like official goals, and then there are what we call the operative goals. And operative goals are your shorter-term goals that are relatively specific intermediate ends. Oftentimes, the operative goal is a shorter-term intermediate goal that will help us then eventually achieve our longer-term official goal. So this introduces some complication into goal setting in our organizations. And that now we have different types of goals. We have those official goals, those longer-term goals, and then we have these operative goals that their greatest utility is helping us along the way to achieve those official goals. There's a famous, I always like to introduce literature into the classes, and so there's a famous public administrator who you may have run into before in the program by the name of Robert Ben, and it's B-E-H-N. And Robert Ben, I think, has a good, useful theory. I hate the term and the name he gives to it, but he has this theory he refers to as management by groping along. basically saying that organizations kind of find their way by trying different things, and they kind of find their way toward achieving their official goals. And one of the ways that they can manage the organization in this way is through having these operative goals, achieving those operative goals, which will then help them achieve their official goals down the road. Now, obviously, the nice thing about having operative goals is it keeps you in the right direction of your official goal. It kind of keeps everyone working in the same direction toward that official goal. It also tends to give us a sense of accomplishment. And so, some of these official goals, they're kind of lofty goals. And they may be goals that we may never actually achieve. We may make progress toward those goals, but we may not actually ever achieve those goals. If we do achieve those goals, it may be several years in the future. That can get frustrating when we're never achieving our goals and we're always working and working. We feel like we're not getting anywhere. That's where these intermediate operative goals become very handy. They give us that sense of accomplishment, which will then give us that motivation to then continue working toward our longer term official goals. But again, on the downside, it introduces this complication in that there are different types of goals, and not all goals are created equally. So what does the literature tell us about goal setting? The public administration literature, as we've talked about before, is very deep. There are volumes and volumes of articles on the management of public organizations. We can learn a lot through the literature, but the literature sometimes has a paucity of focus on goals. And goals sometimes don't play as prominently a role in the topic of the research as would something like managing personnel, and articles that focus on human resource management or on organizational culture or on financial and budget management, or certainly on policy. But the literature that does exist on goals, on the positive side, tells us that goals really can clue employees into the values of the organization and really orient employees toward the mission of the organization. So they're good guideposts, if you will, for our employees. As these good guideposts for our employees, we also know that goals can help us clarification of goals can help us improve our efficiency and improve our productivity. People can be more efficient when they know what they're trying to achieve. They can be more productive in trying to achieve those things because they're motivated by having these clear, well-articulated, and measurable goals. Now, the problem is a lot of our goals aren't terribly measurable, and we'll get to that issue in a second. On the downside, though, the literature also tells us that there are some problems, not just for practitioners, but for theorists as well, with this idea of goals in organizations. One major problem is that goals are multiple. We have a multiplicity of goals. When you have a multiplicity of goals, obviously those goals can come into conflict with each other. You think about just going back to our values and our values of effectiveness and efficiency. And as you know, effectiveness and efficiency, although meant to work hand in hand, do not always complement each other. So you can be effective in that you are serving the needs of your citizens, of your clients, if you will, but you're not being terribly efficient with your resources because you're spending a lot of time and devoting a lot of money for every single case that you are dealing with. You could be efficient, but then not be effective in that you are serving more and more clients, you're serving more and more citizens on a daily basis using fewer resources, but the service you're providing is not this level of service that it should be. So, you're basically providing a level of service, but it's not where it really should be in order to meet the needs of your citizens. And so sometimes you can have this conflict between what you're trying to achieve as an organization. As we said before, sometimes those operative and those official goals come into conflict with each other. Your short-term goals and your long-term goals sometimes can come into conflict. The hope is that these short-term operative goals are designed in a way to help us achieve our long-term goals, but sometimes they're not, and sometimes they conflict with each other. We know that one goal leads to another and is operative for a higher, more general goal. And so sometimes we have these value discussions about what we call the balance of the goal, how important the goal is. And sometimes we become very myopically focused on this operative goal, and we lose sight of the longer term official goal that this operative goal is going to try and help us achieve. It's one of those bureaucratic dysfunctions that Robert Merton talks to us about. So we know goals can have benefits. We also know the literature tells us that goals can also have some problems and some drawbacks. Where the literature kind of agrees is that the goals that are promulgated in the public sector and public organizations tend to be more vague and ambiguous and intangible than those that are created in the private sector. And I don't think we're surprised by that. I think if you work in the public sector, you probably feel this, especially if you've worked in the private sector before and then moved to the public sector or vice versa. You've probably realized that public sector goals sometimes can be much more amorphous than their private sector counterparts. So I guess my question for you is, why are our goals more intangible and more vague in the public sector than what we typically see in the private sector? What are some of the reasons for
that? Well, the private sector certainly be kind of a money-making enterprise, so that sets a pretty tangible and quantifiable goal right off the bat for every money-making organization, which is most of the private sector.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most prominent reasons is that in the private sector, as we all know, there's that bottom line, there's that profit incentive, and that's relatively easy to measure. And that's a very tangible type of outcome that we are measuring. We don't necessarily have that in public sector organizations. And so we don't have that tangibility, if you will, to our goals. Let's see. Let me just pick one up in text chat and then we'll come back. Serving a lot of people, providing a lot of different types of services. Absolutely. Our environment is much more heterogeneous and much more varied in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And when you're serving a more heterogeneous population with a broader set of wants, needs, and desires, it becomes more difficult for you to have those specific tangible goals. As Jonathan says, it can change depending on the political landscape. This heterogeneous environment we're operating within, as we've talked about in previous weeks, is a very political type of environment. We have more people to answer to. As we always say in public administration, we're serving those many masters. And so, yes, we have to make our goals broader in order to meet more needs and more varied types of wants, needs, and desires. I'm sorry, someone was going to say something. Did I miss anyone?
Put it in the chat.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. I think those are all very valid reasons. And I think that we would all agree that, yes, our goals tend to be a little bit more intangible. That then obviously has profound implications, as we said before, for motivation, commitment, and satisfaction, because if employees do not clearly understand what the goals are and how to achieve those goals and the metrics we're using to measure goal achievement, it's going to have a negative impact upon motivation. So I think everything that was said is absolutely true. And, one of the additional reasons that really, plays into all this is the existence of vague mandates. Again, when you think about it, bring that political dimension back into the discussion. When you think about it from a political perspective, if you need to get something through a legislative body, it's not going to be able to be very specific. You're going to have to leave it vague and general in nature in order to get an agreement of a majority of members of that legislative body. So whenever the enabling legislation is vague and ambiguous, the goals for organizations oftentimes tend to be vague and ambiguous as well. Now, obviously, through the rulemaking process, we're going to try and write rules to implement those vague pieces of legislation, but oftentimes there's not a lot of guidance in writing those rules, and so those rules don't really help to clarify relationships and clarify the goals of the organization. So again, overlaid on top of all the appropriate answers we've had so far, I think we would lay another one over there, and that would be these vague mandates and these vague pieces of enabling legislation. Tanya also says in text, which is correct, arranged in chains and hierarchies. Sometimes a goal will appear very obvious to people at the upper echelons of the organizational chart, but sometimes that information is not communicated appropriately down to the rest of the organization. So leaders will be frustrated in that they'll say, well, it seems clear to me, why are our employees not getting these goals? Well, because it's not really been clearly communicated to them, especially if they have not been involved in the strategic planning process. That's why it's so important to involve all of our relevant stakeholders in the strategic planning process. See, Enrique says some organizations have mission statements, vision statements, and guiding principles. Yes, and we are going to talk about mission and vision in a second, but yes, yeah, when your goals, oftentimes your goals are going to, or at least they should, flow directly out of your mission statement. And you've worked with mission and vision statements before, so the mission statement really is a statement about who we are as an organization, who we are and why we exist. And so flowing directly from that mission statement will be the goals of the organization. So, for instance, in my MPA program, our mission statement is, the Graduate Center will recruit and educate a diverse student population with the skills and techniques necessary for efficient and effective leadership, management, I forget what the third one is, leadership management policy analysis in the public and the nonprofit sectors. So that is an expression of, this is what we are here to do. And our goal is really spelled out right there in our mission statement of who we are. Vision statements, as Enrique mentions, vision statements are, where do we see ourselves, who we want to be as an organization, where do we see our role in the future in our community and in our jurisdiction. And I've done a lot of work with NASPA and accreditation of MPA programs around the country. Every MPA program has to have a mission statement. Every MPA program has to have a vision statement. The vision statement for most MPA programs is to be the premier graduate public affairs program and then fill in the blank in terms of what jurisdiction they're serving. So, for my MPA program, it's to be the premier MPA, graduate public affairs program in Southern California. Now, some other programs that I've worked with, they're nationwide. I won't mention them, but there are some large universities that are nationwide. And so their jurisdiction, as they envision it, is the nation and the world. And so that's incorporated then into their vision statement. In terms of accrediting graduate public affairs programs, a few years ago, the accrediting body called NASPA decided that everything needs to flow out of the mission statement. And so everything is mission driven. That then means that everything you do in your program, whether it be the way in which you design your curriculum, the way in which you recruit faculty, the way in which you retain faculty, the way in which you recruit students, the way in which you involve your stakeholders, the way in which you manage your resources, the way in which you place students into jobs, for either internships or careers, the way in which you convey the competencies that are needed for success in the public and nonprofit sector. Everything that you do as a program needs to be tied back to your mission statement. And one common thing whenever I serve as a site visit chair, one common question we have is, how does this relate to your mission? So we'll have some programs that will have a mission statement where they're educating students in, for success in public affairs positions in the nation. And then they'll tell us, but we recruit our students from the undergraduate program at our university. And all of our students are then placed in positions in agencies in our home city. Question that becomes, there's a disconnect there between what you are saying in your mission statement, who you are and what you're doing as an organization, compared to how you're actually doing it on the ground on a daily basis. So that's extremely important today in public affairs education, to make sure everything is being driven by that mission statement. So that mission statement of who we are as an organization will, by definition, start expressing some of our goals, and then we will flesh those goals out later on in our strategic plan. I see Amber says, understanding that the County of Santa Barbara departments have to establish a mission statement. And that's not surprising. The vast majority of public organizations will have a mission statement. Now, having a mission statement is different than revisiting that mission statement. And this is another thing I've learned when I've done site visits. A lot of programs will establish a mission statement, and then the mission statement, they're done with it. And the program will evolve. The focus of the program will evolve. The student body will change, and the demographics of the student body will change. The demographics of faculty will change. all these different moving parts of the program will change over the years, but they never really go back and revisit that mission statement through a planning process. So it's always important to go back and revisit that mission statement and make sure we are still who we say we were back in that mission statement. So yes, absolutely, mission statements and vision statements, our goals will flow out of those statements as well. So we know that we have a lot of goal ambiguity in our public organizations. And again, that's going to cause some problems for motivating our employees, will certainly cause problems for us in measuring just how effective we have been able to be as an organization. Of the 4 different models of effectiveness that we will cover in the last part of class tonight, that first model, the goal attainment model of effectiveness, is by far the most commonly used model. And when we think about effectiveness, that's usually how we are going to define it. In our first class session together, I put out the word effectiveness, and we talked about how do you measure effectiveness, and the vast majority of responses, and rightly so, well, it's how well we're achieving our goals and how much progress we're making toward achieving those goals. So that's the primary way we usually measure effectiveness. And so if we don't have clear goals, obviously we're not going to know how to measure if we have been effective or any progress we made toward achieving those goals. It's going to hurt in terms of employee performance because we don't really have good, clear indicators of employee performance. If you don't have good, clear indicators of employee performance, that then it will have negative impacts upon your performance evaluation process. And we all know that the performance evaluation process is really the linchpin of the entire human resource management puzzle. There's a really great article from several years ago, and the title of the article, and I'm going to butcher it, but the title of the article was something to the effect of performance appraisals, the keystone to the human resource management process. And the author referred to these performance appraisals as being the keystone. And you're all familiar with what a keystone is. You look at an arch built of stone, and that stone at the very top of that arch is what's referred to the keystone. And it's the keystone, it's the most important because it holds both sides of the arch together. So if you pull out that keystone, both sides are going to collapse upon each other. Argument being, if you pull out performance evaluation and don't have a good system of performance evaluation, then everything else you're doing, whether it be recruiting or training and onboarding or allocation of duties or professional development, sanctioning and discipline, all those other parts of that process will then implode and collapse upon themselves. So I think there are some real tangible reasons why we tend to have vague and ambiguous goals, and there are some practical problems with having those vague and ambiguous goals as well. Let's see, let's go back to text chat and see what we got going on there. See, Enrique says some organizations also invest a great deal of resources into crafting ambitious mission, vision, and guiding principles. However, they file them away, and there's a disconnect between what they do, who they are, what they say in their literature to the public. And that I couldn't say that better myself. That's absolutely true. We oftentimes get involved in these very robust strategic planning processes where we go through a strategic planning process and we say we're going to take a real hard look at who we are as an organization. That will then create a new mission statement, and we'll put together a new strategic plan, maybe a 5 or 7 year strategic plan with all of our goals and strategies for achieving those goals, and then we file it away. And then we really never have a tracking system whereby we hold ourselves accountable for actually doing those strategies that will then help us achieve those goals we've articulated in our strategic plan. And so the mission statement, the strategic plan ends up getting very stale. We never really end up going back and making sure we're actually carrying out that strategic plan. That's very common in organizations. I mean, I've lived through that. You probably lived through it as well. I don't know how many department chair retreats I've gone on where we've done the strategic planning process and we revisit the mission of the college, and revisited the goals and crafted new goals and sub goals, and put together action teams to implement those goals. And that we do all that, usually someplace like Lake Arrowhead over a week or so, and then everybody packs up and goes back to campus, and a year passes and nothing gets done. And then the next year, we're going back up to Lake Arrowhead. And we're saying, well, let's do strategic planning. Well, we never actually implemented our last strategic plan, and we're going to go and start planning again. You know, the old adage is if you're always planning, you're never actually doing. And so I think that's a very salient point. So let's just look a little bit more at this goal attainment model. Okay, so we've got the strategic planning process, and we put together our vision statement of who we want to be and where we see ourselves in the future as an organization. We put together our mission statement about who we are and what we do and what we value and what our goals are. We then use that mission statement to craft a strategic plan where we'll identify our goals and we'll identify strategies for achieving those goals. We oftentimes do that at a macro level, and then we'll do it at a more micro level at our departmental or our unit levels. So we do all this great work in order to flesh out the goals of our organization. Then we'll use those goals as a metric for effectiveness, to see how well we have achieved those goals and what progress we have made. But in order to use that type of a goal attainment model, we have to meet certain prerequisites. If you're going to use a goal attainment model, you're going to have to assume that, number one, your organization has goals to begin with. And I would say, yes, the vast majority of our organizations have goals. But number two, those goals can be discovered. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that we have goals that we express. We have goals that we write down. We have these official goals, but we also know that there are other kind of unofficial goals that the organization also is very concerned about that are not as clearly spoken and not as clearly communicated, at least externally, as our official goals. So sometimes some of our goals are hidden, and we have to try and discover what those goals are. Sometimes some units or departments will have their own things that they are trying to achieve that are not really manifested within the strategic plan and the mission of the organization. We also have to assume that our goals are at least somewhat stable. If we're changing our goals every few weeks and every few months, it's going to be chaotic, and no one's really going to know what's going on, and we're not going to be able to use goals to measure effectiveness. So it needs to have at least some type of stability to our goals. This is the next point is really important, that abstract goals can be converted into specific objective measures. You can put a goal together, but if you cannot develop an operational definition of how we know when we have achieved that goal, you're going to have difficulty measuring it, and you're going to have difficulty measuring effectiveness. So we really need a good operational definition. This is the whole process. If you've done courses in research before, you know this process well. It's a process of going from the abstract to the concrete. Research develop these abstract theories, and then you distill these abstract theories into specific measurable models that have operational definitions for the variables. Well, it's the same type of thing here. We need to take our goals, we need to distill them into goals that have specific objective measures that we can actually measure for effectiveness. And not only that we have specific objective measures for our goals, but we also have access to data that we can collect the data, we can process the data, and we can apply that data in a timely and appropriate manner to measure how well we have achieved those goals. Everything we do in our organization will create data. It will create empirical evidence. Empirical evidence can be quantitative, but it can also be qualitative as well. And I know I've been a faculty member for many years, and several years ago, our college decided it was going to rewrite its what we call retention, tenure, and promotion policy, how you get tenure. And there's a big discussion about the research aspect because, in order to get tenure, faculty members have to have excellence in teaching, research, and service. And there's a big conversation about research and, what research would qualify for tenure. Teaching is pretty transparent. You get teaching evaluations, you'll get a median score in your teaching evaluation. You can then compare it to the department, the college, the university, and you've got some quantitative data you can deal with there. Research is a little different in that different people do different types of research. And Some folks do quantitative research. Some people do qualitative research. I used to do all quantitative research. I've now kind of transitioned to qualitative research because I don't have the time to build the models and do the statistical analysis. But the argument is that both quantitative and qualitative research both counts as empirical. Empiricism, empirical information can be numbers, it can be words and phrases. You're just communicating differently. Quantitative, you're communicating with numbers. Qualitative, you're communicating with words and phrases. But can we develop this empirical evidence, this empirical data, in order to be able to measure how well we have accomplished our goals? And we really need to meet all those prerequisites if we are going to be able to use the goal attainment model in order to measure the effectiveness of our organizations. Now, again, I think all organizations have goals. It's just a question of how readily transparent and discoverable are they, how clear and measurable are they, and do they result in the type of information we need to analyze in order to measure the achievement of those goals. I think that's where we kind of struggle a bit in the public sector, primarily because our goals are more amorphous and more vague than in the private sector. Oops. All right, give me 1 second here. Okay. Oops, going the wrong way. There we go. So as we said before, oftentimes our goals will come out of the strategic planning process. And I know that most of you have engaged in strategic planning before. Like I said, a lot of you probably have run strategic planning processes for your organization. I've done strategic planning on several occasions in my organization, and different people do strategic planning differently. And so there's really no one accepted set of steps that you go through in strategic planning. But basically, when you do strategic planning, you need to first conduct a needs assessment. You need to go out there and you need to do an internal as well as an external assessment of your organization and the needs of the organization. How's the organization meeting the needs of the external environment? How's the organization meeting the needs of the internal environment in terms of employees, their human resources? You really need to have this kind of internal and external assessment to know where you are as a jumping off point. Through the strategic planning process, you'll have those hard questions about who we are as an organization and why do we exist. For organizational legitimacy, one of the primary goals of every organization is to differentiate itself from other like-minded organizations, other similar organizations. One of the primary ways that organizations survive is through differentiation, that they can differentiate who they are and what they do from other organizations in the environment. If you're not able to differentiate yourself, then decision makers, budget makers, your appropriators are going to ask the question, why are we funding you when we have another organization that's doing very similar functions? Can we just merge you together, or can we replace you with this other organization? So it's important that you do that type of differentiation. So how is what we do and how we do it different than what other organizations are doing? You define your mission statement, you craft a vision statement, as we had talked about before, how we envision ourselves in our environment and where we like to see ourselves in the future as an organization, where that's our vision for the future. We establish our goals and our objectives, establish strategies for achieving those goals. And so typically you'll have goal number one, and then you'll have objective or sub-goal 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you'll have specific strategies for how you achieve each one of those sub-goals or objectives that will then lead you to the achievement of your overall goals. There's always the question when you're doing strategic planning, how many goals do we need to have? Again, there is no magic number for the number of goals that you need to have. It will depend, my favorite answer, it depends on the organization, what the organization's doing, who the organization is. They need to be achievable, though, during a certain time frame. So if you're putting together a strategic plan, you've got 20 different goals, it could be very difficult for you to be able to achieve all those goals. They start conflicting with each other. The resources you're devoting to one goal will be resources that cannot be devoted to another goal. You've got these built-in opportunity costs because you have finite resources. So you really want to limit your goals to the most important goals that will help you achieve your mission as an organization. You develop the measurements for how you will measure if you are achieving those goals and progress toward those goals. Develop those action plans for, this is what we're going to do, and this is when we are going to do it. And so you lay out the time frame for this, the actual strategies that you're going to be employing and the activities that you are engaging in to help you achieve your goals in that timely manner. Oftentimes you'll do that at the macro level for the organization, and then you'll also do it at the micro level for programs, departments, and units. The trick there is to make sure that the strategic plans that are created by programs and units and departments match with the overall strategic plan for the organization as a whole. The university structure, the university has its strategic plan, college will have its strategic plan, departments will have their strategic plans, and then oftentimes programs within larger departments will have their strategic plans as well. They all need to fit within each other to make sure that what the program's doing will help meet the mission of the university as a whole. You have to get feedback from, first you have to get resources in order to be able to do these strategies. You have to do feedback, get feedback from your stakeholders, internal as well as external stakeholders. Whenever I do accreditation site visits, that's one of our primary questions. Who are your stakeholders and how did you engage these stakeholders in the mission development process and the strategic planning process? What role did they play? What I have found typically is that outside of nucleus faculty in MPA programs, most of the participation is kind of cursory type of participation. So the nucleus faculty will put their mission together, they'll develop a strategic plan, then they'll take that mission and that plan to students and to part-time faculty and to administration and to their advisory board if they have one, and then ask them to review it, rather than having those stakeholders involved in the process. Now, again, that's a double-edged sword. You want to include your stakeholders in the process so that you can engender buy-in. And one of my favorite theorists is Martha Durthick. And Martha Durthick talks a lot about the importance of having buy-in on the part of your implementers. If your implementers do not buy into this, they are not going to implement it appropriately. It kind of goes back to that Pressman-Wildowski type of idea. So how do you get their buy-in? You involve them in it. You get them some skin in the game, if you'd like to say that. You get them involved so that they have a vested interest in seeing this strategic plan effectively implemented. So that's the good part of bringing in stakeholders. The downside, obviously, is it can become very chaotic. You've got a lot of stakeholders, you're bringing all these stakeholders in. It may be very difficult for you to find some focus in this strategic planning process, and you have chaos, and when you have chaos, nothing's going to get done. So it's kind of, finding that happy medium where you can involve them without creating a chaotic process. Obviously, strategic plans then have to be approved at the upper echelon of the organization, and you need to have an implementation and tracking system. Like Enrique said, you can't just let it sit there. You have to have a tracking system to hold people accountable for making progress toward the achievement of these goals. The one thing that we oftentimes do is we will place one person, we'll create different groups, if you will, for our different strategies. And then we'll have one person in charge of each one of those groups. And those individuals in charge of those groups will then have to report back the progress that was made by their group on that specific strategy that would then contribute to a specific goal. But again, they're not going to want to do that, put forth the effort to do that unless they really feel that they have a vested interest in the success of this strategic plan. Now, again, strategic planning is a very frustrating process at times. I'm sure that if you've done strategic planning, you've probably been frustrated. I don't think anyone's done strategic planning that hasn't been frustrated. It can be a really messy process, but it is important for us to do that in order to articulate goals that are measurable and that really do relate back to the mission of our organization and who we are and what we are doing as an organization. Now, I'm assuming that the organizations that you work in have goals. You know, that's one of the basic assumptions we're going to make, is that yes, organizations do have those goals. What I would like to do is I would like to, again, break us up into our breakout groups a little earlier tonight than normal, but then have each one of our breakout groups discuss the goals from your organizations, from your respective organizations, and look for some similarities in those goals between your organizations. And I'm hoping that each group can find two similar goals that are shared by most of the organizations in the group. Share out, after we're done with our breakout group, share out those two examples of goals from your organizations, and then how these goals affect employee performance and effectiveness. So the kind of so what question. Okay, we have these two goals that are similar across most of our organizations. Well, so what? You know, how do having these goals help us be more effective and help our employees be more productive? So I think that's a good exercise so that, again, you can communicate with each other about your different organizations. And really what we're looking for is a similarity, trying to find two similar goals across all the organizations in the group and sharing those out. Now, again, as always, you'll want to find a spokesperson in your group. And let me go ahead and so do our breakout groups here. Give me 1 second. My computer's being a little funky here. Okay, there we go. All right, it looks like we have 26. So let's go ahead and we'll do our normal 4 groups. I think that works pretty well. So created 4 groups. I'm going to go ahead and open up those groups. Before we do that, are there any questions about what we're doing in the breakout groups? All good? All right, perfect. I'll open up the groups. Let's say we'll work on this until about 7:15 or so. We'll reconvene at 7:15. We'll share what we came up with as groups. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back for maybe half an hour or so, and I'll introduce the 4 different models of effectiveness, and we'll talk about what they are and how they work. So I'll open up the rooms. We'll work on this until, say, 7:15, and then we'll reconvene. Okay, the groups are open, so have at it. Okay, we are back. So let's see what each group came up with, and we'll see what types of similarities with differences we have. So let's start with group number 1.
I think we were in breakout group 1. So I'm going to go, unless if it's another group, let me know.
No, you're good.
Okay, cool. So I just realized it said share out 2 examples. We really focused on 1 example, but it took us a while to get to like some common goals between all of our organizations. One of the first ones that we were kind of exploring was this idea of like technology and I guess using newer resources and implementing newer resources in the workspace. And that kind of had come about for some organizations prior to COVID and then maybe some after. We didn't really focus on that one though. The one that we really focused on was like a really broad goal, which was essentially that our organizations are working to serve our customers and to meet our customers' needs at the end of the day. And that kind of translated across both the public sector and the private sector. We had someone from the private sector who, although maybe the goal is to have a profit, they can't really do that without actually meeting their customers' needs or responding to those. So we focused on that a lot. And then when we talked about how these goals affect employee performance and effectiveness, it was a really interesting conversation. I enjoyed it. Our group kind of landed on the fact that we actually don't think organizational goals really impact employee performance and effectiveness. We felt that an employee's individual and personal motive for coming to work might at times align with the organizational goals, but even when it doesn't, that doesn't necessarily mean this organization saying that this is my goal impacts whether or not I'm showing up to work and giving it 110%. When there's this alignment of personal and organizational goals, we see that maybe employees thrive more in the workplace and are more motivated to be there. But we did talk a lot about like, how do you give external motivation to an employee who maybe their personal goal isn't aligning with the organizational goal. And some organizations have to give like bonuses or have to like offer a day off to kind of increase or I guess keep employees motivated and have higher performance. But our group kind of came to the consensus that we didn't necessarily feel organizational goals are impacting employee performance so much as like what is an employee's internal reason for wanting to perform at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good point. I would not disagree with you. I think that's a very good point, and I think you're also right on the mark when you say that when the individual goal and the organization's goal, when they come together and when they are similar, that's when we tend to have those higher performance levels, and we tend to enhance effectiveness. That's one of the goals of, no pun intended, of every organization, is to find that point of goal congruence between individual employees and the organization. But I think you're right. I mean, individual goals and the motivation on a personal level certainly will have a big impact, and probably a bigger impact on motivation and performance than perhaps the macro level organizational goal. But it's always ideal if we can find that point of goal congruence. That's when we tend to have motivated employees. That's when we tend to have higher levels of productivity, and that's when we tend to have a much better chance of meeting our organizational goals. Perfect. Thank you, Natalie. Very well done. I appreciate that. Room number 2.
Hi, everybody. It's Lauren from Group 2. We all had very similar, although we all come from very different organizations, our mission statement and our goals were really around to provide service and support, improve lives, improve individuals, empower individuals, to promote and serve our diverse communities, whether that be for skills to thrive or professional tools, but it really boiled down to providing services, resources, and support for our communities. We had a range of impact around the conversation around employees and how the goal and a mission affected performance and effectiveness. Some have more strict regular appraisals that sort of drive their mission and their work. Others like revisited the mission more often to anchor the work in conversation and goal setting. Different people had different checkpoints for accountability. A couple people did speak to that intrinsic motivation of just being driven by doing good work for their people and for their community, and how those performance evaluations and measurements were captured in data and numbers, whether that be, impact or students or reports turned in. But there definitely was a similarity around intrinsic motivation and why we joined our organizations for the mission itself.
Great. Very good. Thank you, Lauren. And
thank you.
Just pick up on a couple of points here. The one that you talked about in terms of consequences for our citizens, and looking at how our organization is serving citizens as a goal, a major goal of the organization. I think that's a very important goal. That's really the bridge between, if you remember when we talked about some organization theories, and we talked about Robert Burton, and we talked about his consequences-based type of measurement for organizations, that we shouldn't look at the rules and regulations necessarily as being our goals, but our goal really should be, are we providing the benefits, and are these programs and services having the consequences for our consumers that we want them to have? But that's really what he says the focus of the organization should be. That's really what the goal of the organization should be. I think the focus on intrinsic motivators is a very important one, especially in the public sector. There's been a lot of work done by people like James Perry and Ed Kellogg looking at the comparison between extrinsic and intrinsic motivators, most notably the comparison between money, pay for performance, and more of intrinsic things such as a feeling of helping people, and a feeling of being in accordance with the mission of the organization, which is to benefit society and benefit the public as a whole. And I think they did find that for the most part, it really was that intrinsic type of motivation that held sway in the public sector far more so than the extrinsic motivation. Now, the criticism, I'll stop after this, but the criticism of Perry and Kellogg is that Some people say, well, yeah, of course, because we don't have pay for performance on a broad scale in the public sector. Maybe if pay for performance did exist, then maybe you would see a shift from intrinsic to extrinsic orientation for motivators. And that's kind of the criticism of Perry and Kellogg. Okay, great, perfect. Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.
Let's do room number 3.
Okay. So we had people from different types of organizations, including one person was from the private sector. We kind of had a little difficulty narrowing down like 2 common goals, but customer service was our first one and integrity was our second one. And integrity kind of covers a lot of different aspects: transparency, accountability, that kind of stuff, and responsibility. I think these goals affect employee performance. It kind of sets a standard. You know, you're here to serve the public and serve them well, and in doing so, you're honest and you're accountable and you're transparent in your actions. And because our organizations kind of emphasize those 2 goals very well, it sets a standard, I think.
Right. Yeah, and that is, one of the major differences between the sectors is, that heightened accountability, that heightened transparency in the public sector. And the argument in the public administration literature that we always try and deal with is we know we have to have a goal of accountability and transparency in our public sector organizations. But we also know that sometimes that heightened expectation for accountability and transparency could then present some problems in terms of recruiting people into the public sector. That if you had your choice between a public and a private sector organization, and you may be able to get compensated more in the private sector organization, and you don't have the same transparency and openness requirements in the private sector, sometimes it's tough to get those private sector folks into the public sector. There's, the literature calls it this, shock of ethical upgrade, moving from private sector to public sector, and a lot of that revolves around those accountability and those transparency types of requirements. So it's really interesting to see how COVID has affected some of those expectations as well. And I told you, I served on a school board for 6 years and overlapped into the world of COVID my last couple of years on the board. And it really changed our functions in a very profound way. In that, we had to migrate online into virtual sessions, but then it was, the governor gave us some flexibility in terms of moving online, but then it introduced an entire host of technological issues that we didn't have to deal with before with these virtual sessions in terms of public comment and, the public's opportunity to participate in the board meeting being held in that virtual environment. But yes, there's a huge difference in accountability and transparency between the 2 sectors. Very well done. Okay, and our final group, last but not least, room number 4.
Yeah, so within our group, a common thread that we identified, so a group shared that with their goals were really about centering community. So a lot of their day-to-day roles involved community, whether that be at tabling events, creating partnerships in the community to attract new members and volunteers, and then to highlight an example of how, so that was the primary goal that we sort of all found common ground on. And then to specifically highlight an example of the organization, of how the organization's goals can lead to more effectiveness. Melissa in our group shared that one of their goals is around fiscal responsibility. So this showed up in their day-to-day operations in the office. And one specific example was about being resourceful by using outdated envelopes that were still usable, and thus the organization was able to save money. So that was primarily the goal that we sort of found commonality on and really focused on.
Good. Very good. And yeah, trying to save money because we have those finite resources, and those finite resources typically come from public taxpayer dollars. And so we have that heightened accountability to make sure that we are spending those taxpayer dollars in a judicious and in a frugal type of way. my department does the same thing with reusing envelopes. And, it does sound like a minor thing, but when you are sending out all this correspondence and if you can reuse those envelopes, it does save a little bit of money. And so, yeah, fiscal accountability is oftentimes a major a goal of most organizations. And that fiscal responsibility and that need for fiscal responsibility really ties in very nicely to one of the models of effectiveness that we're going to talk about after our break tonight, and that's the systems resource model and how important it is for organizations to be able to obtain those resources and hold on to those resources. And obtaining and holding on to those resources, that's a measure in and of itself of the effectiveness of the organization, because that actually becomes one of the goals of the organization. So great job. Well done, all 4 of our breakout rooms. I think that worked out very well, and I appreciate your hard work. It's 7:30, so let's go ahead and take a brief break. Let's take about a 10-minute break. When we come back, I do want to transition into a discussion of our 4 main methods of measuring effectiveness. And I want to present that information tonight, just in case we don't have a chance to next week, so you have all the information you need in order to perform well on the next, not this one you're doing this week, but the one after that, the Canvas essay. So let's take we'll call it a 10-minute break. Come on back, and then we'll get into a discussion of our 4 methods of effectiveness. Okay, it's 7:40 and we are back. So what I'd like to do in the last part of class tonight, and I'll try and do this as efficiently as possible so I can get you out of here early tonight. But I do want to present these 4 models of effectiveness because we're going to return to them throughout the remainder of the course. And they're also really good models to help you think through how you would measure effectiveness in your organization. There are 4 of them that we talk about in this class. This is not the universe of the different ways of measuring effectiveness, but these I think are 4 pretty good basic models for measuring effectiveness. The first is the goal attainment approach. That's the one we have talked about frequently throughout the class, and so I think we're all pretty familiar with that one. And the second approach is what's called the systems resource approach, and it's very much akin to open systems theory and some of the aspects of open systems theory. The third model is the ecological or participant satisfaction model. And the fourth model is the internal process model. And again, these are all models for how we can measure effectiveness within our organization. So starting with the goal attainment approach, we're familiar with this one. It tries to draw a direct linkage between the stated goals of the organization, like we talked about in the first half of class tonight, and this issue of effectiveness. So we're looking at how well did we achieve our goals, how much progress did we make toward achieving our stated goals. The major shortcoming of the goal attainment approach is that it's a very linear, very rational way of looking at effectiveness. In that, again, we're looking at this straight line linear relationship between goals and effectiveness. It doesn't really consider a lot of those complicating factors that we all know as public servants affect public organizations. It doesn't look at conflict between goals, conflict between official goals and operative goals. It doesn't really take into account communication problems of how well those goals are being communicated through the hierarchy. It doesn't take into account, different conflicts between our different long-term and short-term goals, and conflict between goals and objectives and sub-goals. So sometimes it's criticism. It tries to be too clean of an approach in terms of measuring effectiveness. But despite that, it is the approach that we typically use when we talk about the effectiveness of an organization. We look at how well the organization is achieving its stated goals. So those goals that are stated, flow out of the mission statement stated in the organization's strategic plan. But again, there are complications it doesn't consider. So sometimes it's not quite that easy to draw that straight line linear relationship between goals and effectiveness. So fortunately, there are other ways we can measure effectiveness when perhaps our goals are vague and ambiguous and we don't have good operational definitions and measurements for our stated goals. So the second model, which is an alternative to the goal attainment model, is the systems resource approach. And again, this is very much akin to open systems theory and CATS and CON. The idea that we're looking at how the organization relates with this environment, and we're going to measure the effectiveness of the organization by its ability to pull in valuable resources from its environment. So how capable is the organization? How effective is the organization at bringing in resources such as a skilled workforce into the organization? How successful is the organization in terms of pulling in financial resources, pulling in support from elected officials, or pulling in support from other organizations and networks in the environment? So how well does the organization obtain and exploit resources from its external environment? Now, when we talked about systems theory briefly, we talked about the whole idea of negative entropy, and that organizations tend to dissipate energy and tend to decay as they get older. They become more institutionally rigid. The way you can fight against that entropy process is with a negative entropy, which is this process of pulling in resources from the external environment. The problem with the systems resource approach is sometimes it's difficult to measure. It's sometimes, what we'll probably try and do in the systems resource approach is we will, in a longitudinal type of fashion, we'll put together a longitudinal research design where we will look at the amount of resources the organization has, personnel and fiscal and all these other types of resources at a beginning point in time, and then measure how those resources have grown over time. If those resources have grown in a pronounced manner over time, then the organization has been effective at leveraging its environment in order to obtain those additional resources. Sometimes it's difficult to measure because it's difficult for us to divide out the resources the organization obtained through its own efforts and the resources the organization obtained through no efforts of its own. So if the organization is delivering a certain type of program, the administration changes, and suddenly the administration and the majority in Congress is very predisposed towards supporting this program, more appropriations are going to roll into the organization to support that program. It's not that the organization went out there and got those resources and obtained those resources. Those resources just kind of naturally flow to the organization. So the argument goes, can you really say the organization has been effective at getting resources if it really didn't have that as one of its goals and it really didn't try to go out there and exploit those resources? So again, sometimes it can be a tough one to measure. Usually it's used when we have very vague goals and we can't use the goal attainment approach. So the systems resource approach tends to be used when you're unable to use the goal attainment approach. But again, as you see, the definition of effectiveness is different. Goal attainment approach, did you achieve your stated goals? Systems resource approach, were you able to obtain the surplus resources from the environment and bring those surplus resources into the organization? The third model of effectiveness is called the participant satisfaction model. And this is where it kind of gets a little convoluted. The participant satisfaction model is just what it sounds like. Effectiveness is measured by the ability of the organization to satisfy its key constituencies. So how well does it satisfy its citizens? Is this organization producing the right bundle of goods and services to meet the wants, needs, and desires of citizens in its jurisdiction? Is this organization doing the things it needs to do to satisfy elected officials, budget makers, and appropriators in order to get resources into the organization? So the goal of the organization is satisfying its key constituencies. Now, the big thing here is that we've got two different environments of constituents that we have to satisfy. We have the external environment and we have the internal environment. When we are trying to satisfy those constituencies in the external environment, we are kind of bleeding over into the systems resource model because we're taking a very external focus to how we are trying to satisfy our constituents. We are identifying and defining our constituents as being external to the organization. Again, citizens, elected officials, so on and so on. So it kind of bleeds over to that systems resource model. If, however, our focus is on the internal environment and trying to keep our key constituencies satisfied within our organization, then we are trying to keep our, for instance, our employees happy. And we're trying to reduce their job dissatisfaction levels, keep them happy to hopefully retain them so they don't leave the organization. I know a lot of people are doing their papers on the issue of employee retention and how to enhance employee retention. Well, this model could be very useful for you. So you're trying to satisfy your employees within the organization. When you're taking that internal environmental focus to how you're defining your key constituencies, then this model starts to bleed over into the fourth model, which is the internal process model. And it kind of becomes a human relations type of orientation. You're trying to figure out most effective ways and the best ways, most appropriate ways, we should say, of dealing with your employees to enhance their satisfaction, to make them more productive, and to also retain those employees. So if you're taking the internal focus, your participant satisfaction model bleeds over into the internal process, kind of human relations approach. If you're taking the external focus, you're kind of bleeding over into the systems resource model. But whether you're dealing with internal or external constituencies, the primary goal of the participant satisfaction model is to keep your constituents satisfied with what you are doing and the bundles of goods and services that you are producing. The fourth model is the internal process approach. And the internal process approach measures effectiveness by indicators of internal health. So we're kind of looking at the organizational health of that organization. So we look at things such as the culture. Do you have a strong culture and a positive work climate? If so, those could be indicators of effectiveness in the internal process model. Do you have team spirit and group loyalty, kind of this esprit de corps, as Henri Fayol would call it? Do you have this esprit de corps, this feeling that we're all in this together and we're all working together? If so, if you have that in your culture, that's an indicator of effectiveness. Do you have confidence, trust, and communication between workers and management? Another indicator of effectiveness. Where does decision-making occur? Is decision-making, does that reside near information sources? Meaning that, is the decision authority located, and does it reside with those individuals who are closest to the information needed for making those decisions, regardless of where that position may fall in the organizational chart? So you want to delegate and devolve decision-making to those individuals who are doing this on a daily basis and have the information and are making those crucial decisions daily. You don't want to have a more remote decision-making authority residing at the top part of the organization where those individuals really don't know what's going on the ground on a daily basis. So where's your decision-making located? The sharing of relevant facts and feelings, both horizontal and vertical. Again, this communication system, both vertically as well as horizontally. Rewards to managers for performance growth and development of subordinates and for creating an effective working group. Do you incentivize the proper things? Are you incentivizing managers who are helping their employees to develop as human resources? And again, this is where the human relations component really comes into play. Interaction between the organization and its component parts, where conflicts over projects resolve in the interest of the organization. So we do have these conflicts going on in our organization, they get resolved, and they get resolved in the interest of the organization rather than just in the interest of the involved parties. So you're basically looking at these elements of organizational health as indicators of effectiveness with this internal process type of an approach. And again, when you're doing this with employees inside the organization, it kind of has that human relations, human resource management type of orientation to it. So what are some of the discrete indicators across these 4 different models of organizational effectiveness? Well, obviously, effectiveness is what we're trying to achieve. Levels of productivity, if we can actually quantify and measure on an empirical basis productivity, that's going to be our indicator or measure of effectiveness. The relationship of effectiveness to efficiency. We used that example earlier, those 2 very important values, 2 of the several values that public administration is predicated upon. Are we spending our resources in an efficient manner? Are we trying to do more with less, as we always say, and being judicious in how we're spending these finite public resources? If you're a government corporation, profit will probably work well for you. Obviously, in most government or organizations, profit's not really part of the equation. The quality of the output that you are creating. When we did our little review of organization theory and its contribution to effectiveness, we kind of glossed over an entire school known as quality management. And you're probably familiar with the quality management school with Deming and others, where we're trying to create a quality output. So the work process needs to have quality built into it so that that work process can then result in a quality output. There are some limitations, obviously, to measuring the quality of the outputs we are creating in the public sector, because again, what we are creating tends to be a little bit more amorphous and vague than what would be created by a widget factory, as economists would say, over in the private sector. Yeah, number of accidents, growth, absenteeism, employee turnover, like a lot of folks are looking at, job satisfaction, motivational levels, and we'll talk in a future week, spend an entire week talking about motivation and different motivational strategies for different situations, employee morale, control over what's going on a daily basis in the organization, the amount of conflict versus cohesion in the organization, the amount of flexibility and adaptation the organization is able to exhibit in relationship to its external environment and demands from the external environment. What we had talked about earlier tonight, strategic planning process, goal setting. Do we have an effective process in which we're involving the key constituencies? Goal consensus or goal congruence, as we had talked about before the break. If you can achieve that goal congruence, the congruence between the goals of individual employees and the goals of the organization, that's really how you really strive for that effectiveness. Internalization of organizational goals. I know in a couple of the groups, there may not be that much internalization of organizational goals, but hopefully people know the goals and they can buy into those goals. Role and norm congruence, managerial interpersonal skills, managerial task skills, how we manage information within our organization, and we'd already mentioned communication. Organizational readiness, the ability of the organization to be ready to act proactively to respond to challenges and crises. From a systems resource approach, another indicator obviously is utilization of the environment. Evaluations by external entities, what's our reputation with external entities, and how do they evaluate us as an organization? Stability in the organization, obviously if you have a lot of turnover, especially in leadership positions, you end up being kind of rudderless as an organization. The value you place upon human resources, or the desire to develop your employees as those human resources. The amount of participation, as Mary Parker Follett told us in her writings, the amount of participation within your organization in shared governance and shared influence. The training and development, the professional development, and how much professional development is emphasized within your organization. And the emphasis on achievement, that we as an organization, we want to achieve our goals, and when we achieve those goals, that's how we're going to define ourselves as an effective organization. So we've got a lot of discrete dimensions and measures that you can use in trying to ascertain how effective your organization is being. So let's take those 4 models let's compare them to each other. And one handy way to do it, in my opinion, is to use this approach from Quinn and Rohrbach. And whenever I teach organization theory, which I teach pretty frequently, I really base the entire course and all the theories we talk about on this thing called the competing values framework from Quinn and Rohrbach. This competing values framework allows us to compare different competing models based upon two different dimensions. One dimension across that x-axis you'll see is internal versus external. So those models that are on the left side of the x-axis are going to focus internally to the organization. They're going to measure and promote effectiveness by what's going on inside the organization in that internal environment. Those models on the right-hand side obviously will focus on the external environment beyond the walls of the organization for measuring and promoting effectiveness. On the y-axis, you have the difference between control and flexibility. So at the bottom, those are the models that will emphasize control, kind of in that stable top-down type of control orientation. The ones at the top will emphasize flexibility, being more flexible, allowing your employees to have more self-governance and to participate more in their own decision-making. So when we look at this Quinn and Rohrbach model, these competing values, internal versus external focus and control versus flexibility, the goal obviously is to try and measure the quality of what we are doing as an organization, because the higher the quality of what we are producing, the more effective we are at doing what we say we are doing as an organization. So here they present you with four different models that track pretty closely to the four models we just presented. So at the bottom right-hand corner, you have what they call the rational goal model. This is our goal attainment model that we talked about tonight. In that goal attainment model, we're really focusing on the productivity of the organization and our ability to achieve the goals that we have set for ourselves. It tends to be focused more on control because, again, these are organizational goals. If you can get individual congruence between individual and organizational goals, that's excellent, that's great. But at the end of the day, it's the organization's goals that we are trying to achieve. At the top right-hand corner, you have what they call the open systems model. That is akin to the second model we presented, the systems resource model. The systems resource model emphasizes external focus because, again, we're looking outside of our organization and a very flexible approach to achieving effectiveness. So through flexibility and readiness, our measure of effectiveness will be growth and resource acquisition. So it's very much the systems resource type of model, very external focus. The top left, they call this the human relations model. This is kind of similar to our employee satisfaction model, our participant satisfaction model. We're focusing within our organization. So again, for the participant satisfaction model, that third model we presented tonight, when we're looking inside the organization, then it kind of becomes kind of a human relations, human resource management type of focus, because you're trying to satisfy your internal constituencies. When you're trying to satisfy your external constituencies, it kind of crosses that y-axis and kind of bleeds more into that systems resource open systems model. So the third model, the participant satisfaction model, really can bleed over to the right if you're looking outside the organization, can bleed more over to the left if you are looking more within the organization. And then the fourth model at the bottom left is an internal process model. That's just our fourth model. We talked about the internal process model, looking inside our organization, looking at the processes that we put in place in our organization. And if we have effective processes in creating our outputs, then that is a measure of effectiveness. So again, like we had said before, how you manage information, how you manage communication within your organization, that will then give you those internal process types of dimensions. And you're then going to be able to consider your organization effective because you have all those internal process elements in place. But again, I think I know the words are a little different on this competing values framework, but I think it's a good way to compare our 4 models: goal attainment, systems resource, participant satisfaction, and internal process, because they kind of generally fit into these 4 categories. Again, the one that kind of bleeds over is participant satisfaction, because it really depends upon, are you trying to satisfy your external constituencies or your internal constituencies. So the basic takeaway from this presentation of these 4 different models is that how we measure effectiveness is not a one-size-fits-all approach. How we measure effectiveness really depends upon what we are valuing as an organization. We can decide that we are effective as an organization because we are achieving our stated goals. That would be our goal attainment, kind of this rational goal type of approach. If we define effectiveness as our ability to bring resources in from our external environment, that's going to be our systems resource, akin to the open systems type of model. If we define our effectiveness as how satisfied our constituents are, our participants are, then it's going to depend. If we're looking at external constituents, then we're kind of bleeding over into the systems resource, because in order to get the resources we need, we have to satisfy those who have access to those resources. Then if we're looking internally, then it's that more human relations. How do we keep our employees satisfied? If we have satisfied employees, we have happy employees, that could be an indicator of effectiveness in the organization. And then the internal process model, looking at the jobs that we do on a daily basis, the tasks, and how we control and manage those jobs. And if we have a strong internal process model in place, that's going to be a measurement of our effectiveness. And I'm sorry, I think, Mary, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I have a question. So all of these models, to me, are based on, if you will, the pre-COVID way of working. Now with COVID here and most of us moving to some kind of a mix of working in the office or working at home, or at least not in the office, it seems to me that it's going to make any of these models more difficult to do, because you have a new element that's changing a lot of that dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great point. I would agree with that. I mean, when we have seen this movement to remote work as a result of the pandemic, it makes most of these models more difficult. It certainly makes the internal process model more difficult, because now your internal processes have changed. Now you have people working remotely, some people who are back on site. It's more difficult to have communication sometimes, because you're communicating virtually through email and Teams and things such as that. So I agree. I think it's a great point that our response to the pandemic with remote work is certainly going to make the internal process model a bit more difficult. It's also going to make the employee satisfaction, the participant satisfaction model different as well, because how you keep your participants, your constituencies satisfied could be impacted by how you are doing the work and how you are communicating. You think about, when I served on the school board, when we had those in-person meetings, we had fewer people who were engaged. We had fewer people coming, but they were more directly engaged than when we had virtual meetings. When we had virtual meetings, it was accessible to a lot more people, but they weren't quite as actively engaged. So they were somewhat less satisfied with their ability to affect the policy-making process. Same type of thing, systems resource theory. I think that has certainly been impacted by the pandemic. The availability of resources and the types of resources available in our environment, certainly different now than they were before the COVID-19 pandemic. So I agree with you. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally changed all of these different models of how we measure effectiveness.
I mean, how do you know if you have cohesion? I mean, they don't even maybe see each other. I mean, right now, I seem to run into a lot of people that we're kind of in the same boat, where we've been here with the organization, we'll say a year, but we really don't have a sense of being a part of it. Especially if you're not if you're not in the midst of it. And by that, I mean, we do investigations and we do mediations and stuff like that. So if you're an ancillary, you're human resources, you're somebody's assistant, you don't necessarily participate in all of that. So you don't have, everybody so far that I've talked to that's been there for about a year says, I don't have that sense of what we do, or, you know, you just don't have that feeling in there. And I don't know how to overcome that. That seems to me a big challenge with any organization right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're not to use the word remote again, but you are more remote in terms of what the organization's doing, and your feeling with the organization is that, you know, you certainly are not as connected to your organization when you're working remotely. And another important part of that are the modes of communication that we are using more frequently now as opposed to pre-COVID. And so, you know, the mode of communication that you use can certainly have an impact upon how your communication is accepted and how your communication is interpreted by the recipient of that communication. So when someone may have a conversation face-to-face, the recipient of that information may view that differently than what they would get from you or someone in an email. You know, sometimes people misinterpret emails, and, you know, emails may sound much more curt and much harsher than they were intended. And so I think the mode of communication is also having an impact upon our cohesiveness and upon how we relate with each other. And I say, you know, Angelica said individual time management, accountability are affected both positively and negatively. Yeah, when you are working from home, your time management skills really become very, very important. And the way in which you divvy up your time, the way in which you do your tasks, obviously will be much different when you are working remotely. The question from Enrique, I think, is a great one, is are public organizations ready to evolve, or would they push for control and try to go back to the old familiar ways? That really is the $100,000 question, if you will. Some organizations are trying to go back to the old ways, and they are bringing people back on site and back into a physical location. Some other organizations are allowing people to continue with their remote work. I know in my department, I'm no longer department chair. I'm taking a one-year respite, and I'm enjoying it. But when I was department chair, they were just starting to bring our staff back onto campus. And there's a lot of pushback from staff through their unions saying, well, I've been effective doing my work virtually, so why are you making me come back to campus? And that pushback was effective at making the university slow down its repopulation of the campus. And so now administrative staff are working 50-50 schedules. And so 50% of their time is spent in the office, 50% of their time is spent working remotely. But the university did not do that of their own accord. They did that because they were pushed in that direction. If they were left to their own devices, everyone would be back on campus 100% of the time in the office. See, Melissa says, I created a weekly meeting for my unit without management to bring back the togetherness since COVID. Excellent strategy, and those are absolutely the types of strategies we need to do to try and keep that cohesion. Currently, Amber says, currently each county has discretion to interpret the degree of which to allow telecommuting versus compelling staff to work in person. It's really contingent upon the health officer orders. And yeah, when we tried that approach at the university, where we would do a department by department approach, that didn't work very well in our university because then there were disparities between departments. And the problem is you have some large departments versus some small departments. And so the university is saying we need to have the physical offices open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Well, that's easy for a larger department that has 10 or 12 staff members, because then they can still work remotely and divvy up the remote versus physical task among them and still keep the office open while still working remotely. If you have a department with 2 people and you have to keep that office open 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, that becomes much more difficult for them to be able to work remotely the same percentage as people in larger departments. And so you kind of have that disparity between departments. And so they just came up with a rule of 50-50 for all staff, just to try and make it as equitable as possible. But I think that the normal inclination of a lot of organizations is let's get back to the way in which it was pre-COVID. I think the inclination of a lot of bargaining units is slow that down. If our employees are doing an effective job and getting good performance evaluations working remotely, they should still have the flexibility to work remotely. And I know in the private sector, a lot of private sector corporations told employees you have to come back physically to the corporation. You cannot work remotely anymore. And a lot of those employees said no, and they quit their jobs because they valued the flexibility of remote work more than coming back and keeping their job in the corporation. So it's a struggle, not just in the public sector, but a struggle in the private sector as well. So I think those are all excellent points. And yet, yeah, this is kind of an unprecedented challenge that organizations need to try and deal with. But I just want to present those 4 different models to you just as food for thought. So as you are thinking about your organizations and you're thinking about the problems that are impacting the effectiveness of the organization, I really want you to think about how you know what effectiveness is in your organization. How do you and your organization measure that effectiveness? Is it achieving goals? Is it interactions with the environment? Is it constituent satisfaction? Does it relate to the actual processes that you have going on within the organization, or maybe another way that you would measure effectiveness? But I really want you to think about what does effectiveness mean to then inform your discussion of why this problem is impacting that effectiveness and how can we resolve that problem. Because if you're saying this is a problem that is affecting, that is impacting effectiveness in a negative way, and then you're going to develop 3 different solutions, you're going to need to have a pretty clear idea of what you mean by effectiveness and how you're going to measure effectiveness in your organization. So I would say, consider these 4 different models. Think about how you would measure effectiveness in your specific organization. Then I've got a little exercise if we get together, if we're able to get together next Monday, an exercise where we can go through looking at these models in your given organizations. But I just want to give you this information now just in case we don't have a chance to do that next week. That's all the information I have for you tonight. Again, think about your organization, think about what effectiveness means in your organization and which of these models, or maybe it's a combination, they're not mutually exclusive. So maybe it's a combination of these models that best explains how your organization determines effectiveness and defines effectiveness on a daily basis. So consider this. Hopefully we'll be able to get together again next week and go through our exercise. Also, I have some information on decision making that I usually present at this point in the class. I'm not going to do that tonight, but when we get together, if we get together next Monday after we do our group exercise, then I'd like to present to you some decision making models, some that you've probably run into before in the program, maybe some that are new to you, and how those decision making approaches can also have an effect on the effectiveness of our organization. So if we have time, we get together next week, we'll do that next week. If not, we can then hold that off until the 28th and do that kind of as part of our discussion of motivational models. So for this week, obviously what you're doing, you've got the 2 main assignments, the Canvas essay, where you're thinking about the mission of your organization, sharing that out in our Canvas essay form, and then also your alternative solutions paper. As you're working on that alternative solutions paper, if you have any questions or need clarifications, as always, feel free to email me. I'm leaving town on Thursday, coming back then on Monday. I will have access to email. I won't, be able to respond 24 hours a day, but I will always check my email in the evening. So if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to provide those answers. Okay, well, thank you for the discussion tonight. I'll have this recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow early afternoon, as soon as the closed captioning processes and gets added to the video, but I'll have that up and ready for you tomorrow. All right, well, thank you very much. I hope everyone has a good evening and has a great week, and hopefully we'll talk again next Monday. So take care, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.